Rawesayu, Esra en not ne tuwe na enyasat. Yekwari huetate egwe ufne. Yekwari huetate egwe hiwe. Yekwari huetate le nampani ne lampi. Uchire, uchire, Yahweh Inna. Grandfather, we stand before you today, and we are grateful for the firmament of sky and sun. We thank our grandmother for the generosity of her gifts. May we learn that generosity for our own souls and spirits. We are grateful today for the waters, for the air, for the soil, for the rocks, the trees, the grasses. We are grateful, and we say Yahweh, Grandfather, for all the tiny creatures that make our life possible, for the creepy crawlies, for the four-leggeds, for the wingeds, for those in the ocean. Grandfather, we thank you for our life, for the lives of each other. We thank you and we acknowledge the spirit of the Lenni Lenape, whose ancestral lands we meet today. We ask your blessing on all we do, say, and think. Yahweh Inna. Thank you for that very nice introduction, Barbara. It's so nice to be back with my longtime friend and colleague, Professor Barbara Wall, and I'm very, very happy to be here today and to share a little bit of some of my musings about Saint Kateri, now Saint Kateri. Gadali de Kakawida. And Kateri is the Mohawk version of Catherine, actually. She was named Catherine. And Tekakawida, or Tekakwida, is Mohawk for she who bumps along as she goes. She was a survivor of smallpox, and from the age of 4, she could barely see. And of course, for the rest of her short life, she could barely see. So she was named She Who Bumps Along As She Goes. So it's a kind of endearing name for something that was very harsh that happened to her. I wanted to say that for any gathering in an Iroquoian tradition or Haudenosaunee tradition, any gathering of this sort or any gathering of a ceremonial sort, we always have what is called words before all else, which is some of which I shared with you. Traditionally, back in the day, that a listing of that thank you for all of the levels of life and all of the gifts of Creator would actually be an oratory that would last about 2 days, and it was recited by heart. But I noticed none of you brought your tents and your sleeping bags, so I thought I'd just kind of give you the shorter version today. I've been working with the idea, the presence, the inspiration of Gadali for a number of years now, and I don't want to take away from so many things I want to share with you, but how I did not come to Gadali, she came to me. One morning, inexplicably, I woke up and I just knew I had to drive north to Montreal, and I did, and found myself in the town of Gutnawage, the Mohawk community of Gutnawage, and became introduced in a very spiritual way that I didn't expect to Kateri. And I won't go into all of that now, but it's a wonderful way for research to come to one. Then you know that it's the head and the heart together. And one of the major proponents and tenets of Haudenosaunee good mind is that it's the thinking heart, that you can't just think with your head, but the thinking heart must be in tandem together. So it's been a very wonderful and intimate and enlightening and sometimes frustrating work to come to this idea of bringing Kateri home. And by saying that I want to deepen a cultural narrative for her, I want to expand what she has meant and continues to mean to Haudenosaunee people, and what that can do to enrich and deepen and in some ways complicate what she may mean now that she has entered the firmament of saints. So I'm going to read part of this. Sometimes I will, it's a topic that I love, and I might diverge from time to time, but I have so much I want to share with you. So I have spent a lot of time in Aurisville, which is the birthplace of Kateri. And today, if I start out in Aurisville along the Mohawk River, jump in my car for a drive, and go to that northern community of Gotnawagi that I mentioned, it would be a trip of about 180 miles as the crow flies. And Kateri, she was a small, tiny, halt smallpox survivor, and she made this same overland journey as a refugee orphan from her war-torn home of 17th century Iroquois toward the sanctuary among the New France Jesuits. But she traced a path that was very, very familiar to Haudenosaunee landscape. She was born in about 1656 and of course died in 1680. And her life and conversion, of course, are recorded in the Jesuit Relations. Her father was Mohawk, and her mother was an Algonquin convert to Christianity who had been adopted by the Mohawks. And from the moment of Kateri's death in 1680, there's been a continual campaign of advocacy for her sainthood, actually beginning with the priests that were responsible for her Christian tutelage at the mission in New France. And it's a story of her transformation from an Indian heathen, as it was understood in those days, to Christian convert of the New World. Kateri was venerated in 1943, beatified in 1980, and of course in October 2012, over 300 years after her death, she was canonized at the Vatican as the first Native American female saint. The Jesuit relation texts provide the singular documentation that we have for the many other hagiographic accounts that followed. And they all narrate stories that in some ways seem to take Kateri's identity from her homeland in some sense and transplant her into a political and spiritual terrain that in some ways is alien to her indigenous heritage. And what I want to do with these narratives is to think about them when they're viewed alone. They constitute a kind of, one might say, a literary captivity, an ethnographic entrapment of her life. And what I propose instead is a paratactical approach that lays out key narrative elements of her Haudenosaunee context alongside those of her Christian conversion story in order to read the fullness of Kateri's life as one not estranged from the spiritual and political roots of her own world. To radically transplant Kateri from her homeland, I think kind of promotes a Cartesian consciousness that deems earth honoring indigenous spiritual practices with marks of a lower nature. And this was, of course, the rhetoric that is the inherited rhetoric that we know today. This framework conspires to sever Kateri, and it also conspires to sever natives from their status as autochthonous beings with relationships to particular lands, practices, and effective connections to the natural world that are embedded within understandings and spiritual practices. So to consider the nature of Kateri's literary deracination, we have to foreground some political and metaphorical features attending her appropriation into the structure of a conversion story. So despite the war and sickness and alcohol-ravaged condition of Haudenosaunee lands and communities in the 1600s, the Tree of Peace endured, and it still endures today, as an organizing principle and symbol of the Iroquoian world. And today is in Kateri's day. It is storied into the land and physically embedded in the form of the Confederacy's council fire, centrally located at Onondaga in today's New York State. The Gayanaragoa, the Great Law of Peace, constitutes a message and a paradigm of comfort, a guide for moral and political conduct, and a grounding social structure. The second article of the Great Law says that roots have spread out from the Tree of Peace, one to the north, one to the east, one to the south and one to the west, and their nature is peace and strength. So rootedness in the land provides the ontological condition of identity and a pedagogy of comportment. Kateri was a child of the Mohawk Eastern Door, geography of the Confederacy, structured imagery that embeds the form of the Longhouse itself into Confederacy land. The Longhouse was and still is a spiritual and political home to the tribes of the Haudenosaunee. And that would be the Mohawk, the Oneida, Onondaga, Seneca, Cayuga, and of course Tuscarora. We were the latecomers coming up from North Carolina in the 1700s. According to Longhouse ways, when a young woman joins with an outsider or a consort, the newcomer's arrival is marked by extending the rafters. He's incorporated into the body of the community. The Longhouse literally is made longer. The story of a people expands to receive and adapt to the complexities and nuances of augmentation. The larger story isn't completely biased toward the ways of the newcomer. This protocol has political and social implications as well as matrilineal signals of domicile and authority, denoting whose homeland and whose paradigm prevails. So how to bring together these ideas with a culturally coherent story of Kateri's affinity to certain Christian tenets? In normative terms of Haudenosaunee matrimonial politics, when Kateri becomes a symbolic bride of Christ, she brings him into the body of Haudenosaunee place and politic. Emically understood, Kateri's new alliance makes him a welcomed beneficiary of Haudenosaunee hospitality, diplomacy, and accommodation. So in this context, where clan mothers select and approve the male leaders, Christ's introduction is understood as an accepted guest of an Iroquoian territory, heartland, and hospitality. Instead of permanent self-exile from a geopious constituency, Kateri's youthful escape from the war trauma of her Mohawk Valley home in New York, her acquisition of the tenets of Christianity that she embraced might be understood as adding rafters to the Longhouse. Despite the chaotic wartime circumstances of Kateri's young life, a female's willful and permanent desertion of homeland would have been an unfamiliar cultural model, except in the case of an abduction or a subsequent adoption by a thieving tribe. This was the case of Kateri's mother. She was an Algonquin and captured by the Mohawks and was adopted into the community. So conversion, construed as a rafter-extending event, is a culturally congruent model for Kateri's story. A strong cultural predisposition toward dialectical oratory and consensus of an Iroquoian convert, and enhanced motivation and ability to adjudicate new and unfamiliar forms of religion or social norms in light of native forms and qualities whose content was known and familiar. Alan Greer makes reference to the gendered pattern of conduct typically recorded in colonial hagiographies, the stories of Christian devotees in the New World, whereby holy men were admired for what they said and did, holy women for what they were. Among the saints of New France, this basic sexual division of labor persisted, with the males pursuing more active roles and making their voices heard in the historical record, while the females were celebrated more as virginal treasures. But Kateri's extreme acts of piety while she was at Kahnawake, and they started to separate her from the Society of Native Women in Kahnawake. She wanted to begin her own order. And she demonstrates here qualities of Haudenosaunee female leadership, and also the Jesuit relations record indicates that these initiatives were a little bit of annoyance to her Jesuit mentors as well at the time. But in Iroquoian rubric, these acts would not be remarkable according to the narrative of the Great Law. And now we turn to the peacemaker's journey, who is a very important figure in Haudenosaunee tradition. He came into the land of the Iroquois with his helper and disciple Hiawatha, and all of the poetry you've heard about, in the shores of the Gitchigumi, please, I mean, it makes kind of charming poetry, I suppose, but it has nothing to do with the Haudenosaunee Hiawatha. It's kind of a bit of a mishmash. So he came to spread the great law of peace, He was the first person to listen to this and grasp the concepts of the Great Law was Jigonsase. Jigonsase was a woman whose name became known as the Mother of all Nations, or Great Woman. From this distinction, a woman being among the first to recognize the overarching value of peace through the principles of condolence, and to be won over by the message, came the tradition that designated women in possession of and empowered to confer the titles of the chiefs. In this context, Jigonsase is designated the female receiver of knowledge, already acknowledged as mother, an originary ontological presence. She is also entrusted and imbued with the knowledge and wise tenets of the Great Law. This is a great responsibility and a structural epistemic status within the Confederacy. Another aspect of Kateri's changed life to be mitigated by this side-by-side approach, this narrative approach that involves the creation story genre itself. In the Bible, God creates the earth and all living creatures ex nihilo, from nothing except the power of his word. After the fall of Adam and Eve, the earth becomes a potential domain for evil influence as well as good. Adam and Eve succumb to the temptation of the Garden of Eden, and original sin enters the story introduced by the serpent. The serpent is a symbol, embodiment of lower animal world of Satan's realm, an inherited feature of human nature, sin-prone from birth. By contrast, in Haudenosaunee metonymic systems, the fall of Sky Woman from the upper world mythically signals the beginning of Earth's creativity. It represents life's incipient unfolding. Sky Woman's fall may be figured somewhat like the fall from the heavens of the Gnostics, Sophia. It's a syzygitic moment when the earth and sky, paradoxically, both appear separate from one another and converge in cooperative significance. The narrative of parthenogenesis from the angel Gabriel to Virgin Mary would be a powerful point of recognition for young Kateri, in alignment with Sky Woman's originary role. Sky Woman's descent even produces the image of a type of salvation, a new creation occurring in concert with nature, as broad-winged birds carried her safely to the surface of what in the story is Turtle's Back, the surface of the earth. Muskrat's labor in diving for soil to bring to the surface is a nascent act of an ensemble and community, not private property. And Turtle's Back soon grows to become the surface of the earth itself. In this version of creation imagery, the earth accrues breadth and fecundity from woman's presence, from its own life sources, sui generis, and from the bottom up. So it's evident that the notion of a woman's figurative fall from heaven as catalyst for life's genesis mismatches the directional and moral symbols we've inherited from Eve. It's clear from the extant oral repertoire of Haudenosaunee life that fundamentally and culturally, Iroquois still embrace and endorse the natural world as matrix, matter, and mother, as model and nourishing material substance within which tribal experience endures. Attending this Iroquoian view is a thick assumption of human coextension with entities of the natural world and with the earth itself, both ontologically and effectively. This perspective shapes cultural meaning and endows metaphors with a bias toward material corporeal references. So in Kateri's case, considering her departure from cherished homelands, the temporal dissolution of Iroquoian social structures and cultural lifeways, and the deaths of many of her family members, the aggregate of Kateri's traumatic losses finds credible analogs in the experience of a severed limb. Here, Merleau-Ponty's work in perceptions that reveal themselves through the human body, as well as in the mind, proves useful to reckon the effects of mutilation and amputation. This phenomenon, understood in physiological terms, is no less effectively experienced and no less devastating when applied to the situation of Aboriginal losses of land and cultural structures. In his text, The Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty discusses the familiar syndrome of phantom pain, followed by amputation. The experience of pain in a limb that no longer appears to be part of the physical body. While contemporary work in neuroscience provides a new idiom through which to consider embodied features of phantom pain, Merleau-Ponty's examples remain relevant in this discussion to assess the depth effect on natives traumatically separated from their homelands. This is a severance that, culturally speaking, is tantamount to losing part of the physical self, but with an interesting inversion. In the case of clinical amputation, the loss is visible to an outside observer, while the pain to the aggrieved is often felt in the absent limb. In the case of natives' rupture from sacred homelands, the human body may appear to be intact, but the subjective nostalgic pain is experienced out of sight, inwardly, as if a vital body part has been hacked away. Merleau-Ponty's ideas lay out the symbolic dilemma here, and I quote, "The phantom pain is the representation of an actual absence. Proust can recognize the death of his grandmother, yet without losing her as long as he can keep her on the horizon of his life. Similarly, the phantom arm is not a representation of the arm, but the ambivalent presence of an arm. The refusal of mutilation in the case of the phantom limb is not a deliberate decision and does not take place at the level of consciousness, after considering various possibilities. This phenomenon, distorted equally by physiological and psychological explanation, is understood in the perspective of being in the world. What it is in us which refuses mutilation and disablement is an I committed to a certain physical and interhuman world, who continues to tend toward this world despite handicaps and amputations." Merleau-Ponty's analog here illustrates this category of loss, not as merely contemplated loss, but loss that affects one's very way of being in the world. Apparently, a tropism toward wholeness persists in the amputee's consciousness even after rupture. Displaced natives from homelands, like the human body itself, reject disunity, with a deep sense of this extended self that identifies with place, constituent in land-based knowledge, local phenomenon, aesthetic form, enduring place names, stories, commissary, apothecary, sacred fastnesses, and, today's expression, TEK, traditional environmental ecological knowledge. In the face of deep losses and separation from all these categories, the desire to keep integral relationship to homelands on that horizon of life abides, often ferociously, and this urge occurs no less for lost homelands than for a lost limb. For Indigenous people, the commitment of the I to which Merleau-Ponty refers emphatically includes a particular physical, geographical world imbued with sacred and familial significance, in the same ways that it includes a human community of relationships. Further, Merleau-Ponty's commitment of the I is to its normative wholeness. It bears a tribal analogy to the sovereignty of indigenous nations, the collective body politic, and homelands. Assuming that early native converts' preoccupation was mainly and only to understand Christianity's system of values, somewhat glosses over what had to be an overwhelming context of loss for 17th century Iroquoians in particular. Kateri's personal and cultural world of the mid-1600s was racked by massive loss and trauma. Epidemic sickness, hunger, wartime carnage, alcohol-related debauchery had become commonplace. The tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy warred with outside tribes, such as the Algonquins and the Hurons. The League fought alternately with the Dutch, the French, the British to maintain a once formidable military position in areas now known as New York State, Ontario, and Quebec, and plied with alcohol for trade and treaty and deceit in land transactions. Many Iroquoian individuals and communities were becoming socially and spiritually ravaged. This is evident in the Jesuit relations and the accounts of this ravishment. It was clearly a time when the practiced ideals of the Great Law and the principles of condolence appeared to be extinguished. Such a demonstration of cannibalistic rage surely represented to Christian clerics a biblical apocalyptic manifestation of the sign of the beast. For the steadfast in tribulation among the Iroquois, these acts of cannibalism would signal a state of mind clouded not only by alcohol, but by the anguish of loss and death, conditions that triggered the epic remedy of their peacemaker. As with most of her countrymen, Kateri's losses were direct, personal, and cultural. Her home community near today's Albany, New York, was moved and moved again. Smallpox claimed the life of her mother, her father, her brother, and other of her relatives. A response of the native group of the time speaks to the depth of losses which smallpox was one agent. And I quote from the relations. This disease, and many, has not been engendered here. It comes from without. Never have we seen demons so cruel. The other maladies lasted 2 or 3 moons. This has been persecuting us more than a year. Our native sicknesses are content with killing 1 or 2 in a family. This disease, in many families, has left no more than that number, and in many, none at all. The loss of the old ones was repaired in a few years. This smallpox would require ages to repeople us. So the people of the Longhouse were faced with having their future devoured as well as their past. The very historical moment within which they were moving appeared to be a reenactment of that moribund figure of the cannibal itself. A rabid present was eating all promise of the future for the Haudenosaunee. Kateri herself was a victim of this scourge. As I mentioned, smallpox claimed the life of her parents, and from the age of 4, it left her face deeply pocked and her physical strength and eyesight permanently damaged. Exploring Kateri's life and narrative within the discourse of historical and personal trauma creates an intersection of both the historical record of Iroquoian experience and the principles of Iroquoian creation narratives and condolence rites, so central to Iroquoian perspectives and life. These factors must be taken seriously in any interpretation of Native response to Christianity. Syncretic interpretations and discussions of conversion often fall short in noting these cultural particulars. The discourse of syncretism, like Homi Bhabha's hybridity or Mary Louise Pratt's contact zone, often moves too swiftly and often reductively to a hydraulic resolution of synthesis, especially for understanding the concerns of Native people. Andrea Smith, Indigenous scholar, identifies a useful flexibility for a Native who comes from a primarily traditional background, a flexibility which confounds and resists the totalizing language of syncretism. She states, this flexibility can lessen the need to reinterpret Christian concepts found to be oppressive. Natives who become Christians simply may ignore what they find inadequate or offensive in Christianity and look elsewhere, occasionally to Native traditions, for what they need. I would further argue that the nature of the need for spiritual dimension itself is determined to a great degree by Indigenous spiritual values that may or may not be upheld within a new European religious paradigm of the time. The Iroquois belief in an afterlife was non-punitive and consisted in images that replicated an idyllic version of this life, in which people lived peaceably together, hunted, played, and renewed antecedent family relationships. The receptivity of Native converts to Christianity, pardon me. The receptivity of these Native converts to Christianity was perhaps based somewhat on need, but most likely a pragmatic one created by the rupture of society in which colonialism had helped to create. The deeper question remains of how well a new contingent remedy met the ongoing Indigenous system of particular experience and requirements. The hegemonic language of colonial power relations itself contrives to erase or neutralize the specificity distinguishing multiple Indigenous traditions, and with this gesture, is lost a view of the discrete cultural processes and practices through which natives have met change and created continuity through time. Also, syncretism's preoccupation rests with the strategies of dominant power, with the product of the subsuming encounter. This discourse often fails to reveal knowledge about the indigenous perspectival forces, the internal forces that may be externally situated that vie for survival and continuity during and after the fact of the colonial intrusion. An inquiry into the creative processes brought to bear in the dilemma facing indigenous ontology and epistemology under duress, and the cultural resources that creativity is usually expunged in the prevailing dominant model. In the competitive narrative, what is lost is not accounted for. Indigenous losses are not accounted for here. Here I want to talk about grace. The core of the principle of condolence is built upon the idea of a healthy heart and mind, a healthy psyche, and that no society can exist and continue in health and well-being when unmourned losses have not been grieved, when unmourned losses remain in the heart. The idea of retribution, retaliation continue. So condolence is necessary for a society to sustain itself after a rupture of loss. Grace is either a social or a religious virtue and concept and can be thought of as unearned or unmerited favor. Its production hinges on permission and gift rather than entitlement. The meaning of grace bears a quality of origination, in that the production of grace is often assigned to the realm of providence. Grace is not linked to the dynamics of market. Its production is detached from the economy of exchange value and equivalencies. It's arguable that important elements in the production of grace may even exist outside of the realm of the concept of redemption. We redeem coupons. We use them to receive a bonus or a gift from a source that in turn wishes to encourage our patronage in commerce or some other enterprise. In theological terms, Christ, through his death, redeems sinners. Through the gift of Christ to mankind, God provides entry to everlasting life. According to Christian doctrine, there's no rational accounting for the gift of God's Son, because no human being on face value alone is worthy of such exception from the fate of original sin, except through God's grace. Alexander Irwin states it this way: the divine self-sacrifice defies the utilitarian principle completely. It commands the circularity of ordinary sacrificial procedures. God has, by definition, no utilitarian motives. His gift or sacrifice cannot be compensated by any meaningful return. In a secular, or at least in a sense that's generally spiritual rather than specifically Christian or theological, the virtue of grace interrupts the rather precise, inevitable calculus of revenge and retribution for hurt. Grace disrupts and intervenes to assuage and comfort grief and assist in mourning by providing the occasion and context, an invitation, the narrative, the time suspension necessary to address these things. When the message of the peacemaker was brought to Hiawatha, the peacemaker found Hiawatha deep, deep in mourning. He had lost all of his daughters, his 5 daughters. He had turned to cannibalism. He had lost all hope. And his only thought was revenge for the loss of that which was dear to him. And it is in this moment that the concept, the principles of condolence were brought forth from the peacemaker. And the peacemaker said, I will assuage you. I will clear your eyes so you can see. I will assuage your ears so you can hear clearly. So these principles, there were 15 principles of condolence that were introduced. And it was from this moment that the peacemaker and the Hiawatha joined in their journey throughout Iroquois to carry this message of peace. And then on this idea of assuaging the heart, bringing heart and mind together with the good mind, they established a society, a political structure, also based on the good mind and on peace. Hiawatha had then fashioned and arranged strings of shells into wampum, shells that he found at a nearby lake. He designed these shells and said that he wished someone would come to him, and it was at that moment the peacemaker came. He said to him, "I overheard you talking to yourself. I come to sympathize with you. We will work together. I will now work with you, and I will sympathize with you with these strings of wampum. I'll lift all the burden of grief from your mind and make this day bright." So certain passages of the ceremony spoken by the Comforter relate to wiping away the tears. You've probably heard this term before. These passages articulate an observation of the mourner that you are too prone in grief, your back alone is visible. This corporeal reference depicts the griever who has turned his back on the social order, making him a candidate for the culture of death. The culture of death is typified in the image of the cannibal that eats the present, eats the possibility of the future. The gift of the Comforter voice says, "I shall stoop low in order to utter words to caress and appease you." Everything in the narrative hinges on this crucial gesture of compassion that not only reinscribes the value of the community, but it also exhibits a grace. It upholds and codifies a generosity invented of intention, sympathy, and a good mind. The matrilineal culture of the Iroquois figures society as a woman, and under condition of loss, it is seen as a bereaved wife. Loss itself is treated as an illness, with 15 elements that mark the symptoms of grief. The three main foci of these elements are the eyes, the ears, and the throat. These three corporeal sites foreground the theme of relationship and communication that need to be mended before the life of the individual or the community can come back together. These three sites correspond to, one, a metaphorical illness of unabated darkness you can't see anymore. Two, the illness of silence or isolation that allows morbid thoughts of self-negation and cuts one off from community. And three, the muteness of choking grief, which isolates a person or community and turns his or her anguish into internal despair and destruction and violence. The structure of condolence separates the community into two parts. One moiety consists of those that have suffered the loss, and the one consists of the comforters, the mourners. Though both sides are considered to be mourners, the symbolic separation of the community into two antiphonal facets itself represents the fracture that the loss has created. The mourner side figures as the patient, the female patient, who is ill. Since both sides participate as mourners, the process of restoration benefits the comforter or condoler as well. The rite is entitled At Wood's Edge. And in this rite, the mourners come out to welcome those who have come to comfort them. The edge of the woods here is a significant boundary, and it's a boundary of respect. The comforters call out in prescribed song cycles to the mourners to come forth, but they must not rush into the mourner's space. They're obliged to wait for the mourner to come out and grant permission to enter. Even in this moment of comforting, one can see the gender dynamic of a structure at work here that is female-oriented. The process operates almost as a courting ritual. The love song is sung to beckon a movement of this ailing woman toward the song, toward the lover, toward the reunion, all the while honoring the principle of permission above that of impetuous desire. Recalling the story of the unregenerated Hiawatha who was sick with loss. and his own self-devouring state, we note that his relief does not appear until his voice and his wishes for the comforter are expressed. The principle here is that even the good news of the comfort is obliged to operate within a rubric of respect for the intention of the one who is in need. The permission flowing from personal intention and invitation is the master lock, admitting comfort into the picture and making it meaningful. The commonly used term condolence is used for this ritual, and it's of central importance to Iroquoian spiritual and political life. It derives its meaning in translation, of course, from the Latin colondere, to feel pain with. Of course, we have condolence as the cognates that can be easily conflated with Christian notions of compassion and perhaps even identification with the Passion of Christ. But here, in Iroquoian languages, a common form of the word is used to refer to this important ceremony. The word contains two roots, one referring to permission or to permit, and the other relating to nourishment, as one maintains or feeds another. Fact, two, literally, one food, as it were. The Iroquoian word for the ceremony of condolence in this cluster of concept contains many implications of how we might understand this rite's influence on Iroquoian thought. Kateri's conversion might actually be understood in this way. Again, the conjugation of these clusters of meanings present a concept quite consonant with the narrative of the peacemaker and Hiawatha. It's emblematic of the story's crucial elements of permission and restoration by nourishing the need of someone else that's been famished and ravaged by loss. The simplicity of the literal root, fact 2, food 1, absorbed in the context of ritual structure, reinforces the value of community and sharing. The emphasis is not so much on economic concerns of dividing the food, but rather the concord that the food brings together, brings the parties together. Nourishment is the bonding component. We call it the requickening, which translation implies a bit more of narrative ceremonial regeneration. Returning to the topic now of Blessed Kateri's sainthood, it seems that this uprooting of both name and place from her homeland tends to erase the particular markers of tribal provenance and assigns an exceptional meaning of indigenous identity onto her individual person. This obscures and inverts collective tribal roots and values. The iconic story of Kateri, who deserts lands for heavenly realms, glosses over the barbed issue of indigeneity. It leaves the idea of native homelands, cast since colonial times as biblical wastelands, even more open to colonial architecture of John Winthrop's utopian city upon a hill. According to condolence, society itself depends on the good mind, a mind unburdened by the destruction of unmourned loss. Not just death, but the culture of death is cast as the enemy of society. During the peacemaker's journey to bring the great law, he encounters resistance and rejection from leaders of the Onondaga Nation. Foremost among his detractors is the powerful leader and seer, Taradaho. Taradaho is intellectually brilliant. He is a hideous figure and is crowned with the sign of cunning snakes coiling through his hair. He is vexed. He is a vexed image that certainly Christian Jesuit missionaries may well have found to be useful, although perhaps inaccurate, mnemonic for the evil one himself. Through enraged despair over his own losses, an embittered Taradaho has turned to a life of revenge, murder, and indeed cannibalism. He has a sinister talent for combining his traditional knowledge of medicines and keen intuition about human nature to bring others undoing or death. In this, he's known and feared among his people as a cannibal, a person in a state of arrested mourning, whose devouring nature increases his and society's losses. Eventually, Taradaho is persuaded to accept the message of peace, conveyed through condolence. The peacemaker and Hiawatha promised Tadadaho the prime responsibility of power as keeper of the central fire in the emerging Confederacy. This epic role of Tadadaho and that narrative is now permanently codified in the continuing political offices of the Iroquoian Confederacy. The perpetual story of his conversion is reinscribed each time Tadadaho, the one who plays the role of Tadadaho, dies and another is condoled or installed. So he moves from cannibal to be the one with the most responsibility in the Confederacy. He's not rejected or banished, but incorporated and given an important position in the continuing life of the community. This, again, is a grace, a condolence grace. Dominic LeCapra makes important distinctions between loss and absence, which come to bear in the configuration of the cultural work of transformative cultural narratives. He holds that losses are specific and involve particular events and accrue to real people and cultures of affected groups. Whether individual or collective, the losses are historical and personal. They entail real calamities, consequences, perpetrators, and victims. On the other hand, the language of absence is reductive, abstract, and ethereal, but absolute. It appears disembodied and evacuated of subjects. Perhaps most importantly, for this discussion, he notes that it downgrades the significance of particular historical losses. In distinguishing the difference between these two, LeCapra states that losses may entail absence, but the converse may not be the case. In terms of absence, one may recognize that one cannot lose what one never had. LeCapra's work on absence and loss is especially helpful here to identify and distinguish between possible modes of reception of Christianity by native converts and what mission Jesuits may have expected to follow from the conduct they witnessed in their Iroquoian neophytes. Condolence procedures work with an interplay of loss and absence as well, but by giving voice and place rather than ignoring or displacing that which is lost. The remedy of condolence is through applying the situations of loss, the mythically enacted vision of comedy and sound mind to restore the community. Thus, another real task of conversion for the Jesuit mentors of Kateri and her companions can be seen as appropriating the narratives of discrete historical losses and converting that story into a narrative of absent ideal. This can in no way be effective or satisfying, let alone healing. The conversion account of an indigenous saint cannot take place without the conversion of a deeply held cultural narrative. That this deep cognitive shift and identity rupture actually occurred in Kateri's experience is, I think, doubtful. From a native and specifically Iroquoian perspective, the great problem in working exclusively with a hagiographic narrative of Kateri's life is accounting for that radical vacuum where an account of grief and mourning should be. The omission of any reference to the affective component of her response to her own losses of loved ones, community, and land taints the conversion narrative from the outset. Much of this is a structural problem. Hagiography has a singular goal. It is organized, and its trajectory is to transform the subject from pagan to convert to saint, so the sanctified figure can become a vehicle to produce in turn more converts. This omission of narrative, of indigenous narrative voice, is a large and familiar colonial gesture that conspires to erase the very essence of condolence in this case. The indigenous experience of Kateri's Christian conversion, the grief of loss, does not figure into the triumphal outcome, so the trauma and lost elements are reckoned as negligible. The model of the greatest good obtains here when it states that hagiography and the narrative of the saint's life passes through an assimilation. Richard Kirchheffer invokes a word highly charged with specific historical import in native memory and experience, that of assimilation. As with the terms hybridity and syncretism, the story embedded in the concept of assimilation foregrounds the product of change rather than conditions and loss of the process. From the Native perspectives, the forfeitures are a real part of that story because they have been a real part of their own human wholeness before the loss. There is no profligate waste. The cultural work that Iroquoian traditions of mourning fulfill through condolence process is to employ formalized oratorical mechanisms of thick description to acknowledge the value of what and who has been lost and reinvest honorary status for the beloved back into the community and to the individuals affected. The Jesuit Relations contains the only written record of Kateri's life, and it is not deeply informed by the traditions of her own heritage. We are presented with a strong notion of her physical being, her ailments, her frailty, her blindness, her ascetic acts of self-mortification, all these, but not with a complete sense of her voice, her Haudenosaunee voice. Her few recorded utterances are selected, but they don't give us a sense of who she was as an Iroquoian woman. Kateri has been called the Lily of the Mohawks. Driving on New York Route 5 today, one comes upon Kateri's National Shrine in Auriesville. Along that Route 5, on a summer's day, I pass profusions of daylilies, growing untended. They're not the tidy white blossoms of church altar lilies, but a deep russet color, marooned by the sun. They wave in the breeze. These blooms' connection to the earth is tenuous. A thin stem, easily severed, would deprive the lily of its vital life source. As the exceptional lily of the Mohawks in these hagiographies, Kateri may be marooned, alienated, and isolated from the earth. As self-proclaimed exceptional beings, so too may we be. The roots and life of Haudenosaunee people are in Haudenosaunee lands, entwined with the symbolic great white pine, the tree of peace. The organic nexus of confederacy is the network of the white roots of peace moving out from this space. Even though turbulent times have passed and may continue to come, often disheartening centuries of colonial intrusion, they still grow in the deep, rich, dark earth. Below the topsoil, they quietly transgress all artificial boundaries of nation states and surveyed property lines. What is essential and enduring is connected to and coextensive with this land and with these roots embedded in the loam. They absorb a grounded nutrition of social, spiritual, and diplomatic proportions. The tree stands firm, and its roots, like Iroquoian people, the Onkwehonwe, have traveled far and wide over the years, but our movements can always be mapped back to homelands. Kateri Tekakwitha, Gareli de Gagawida, is still a daughter of the eastern door of the Confederacy. And while lilies come and go with the seasons, for me and for many Haudenosaunee, tribal Christian or tribal Longhouse, she stands with and for that singular living tree of peace. So in this exploration that straddles time and experience and ways of knowing, what are we to think? Introducing a dynamic indigenous presence and voice within the sacralized canonical space of an Indian conversion narrative is an act of liberation theology and decolonization. And by decolonization, I do not mean to de-Christianize, but I do mean to render transparent the rhetorical and conceptual devices that conspire to terminally alienate Kateri, and by extension, to alienate us and other Native people from ontological, spiritual, and political identity with our own homelands and tribal nations. My Tuscarora mother often spoke about the thrilling danger of old-time Iroquoian fireball game that she used to play at home on the reserve. And they would take soaked balls of rags that were soaked with kerosene, and at night they would take them and light them and throw them back and forth with each other. And she said it was thrilling, it was exciting, and terribly dangerous. And so this work of what we have to do together, to think of how do we today embrace Kateri, how do we understand her indigeneity, how do we take her as what she has become, is a symbol of and a saint and a patron saint, perhaps, it may end up to be, of the environment. You have seen this, the iconography already. It's been written up many times. And what does that mean? She surely, if she had had her canonization 100 years ago, it would have been 1912, the very year of that hubristic Titanic sinking, right? It's unlikely that if her canonization had happened then, that she would have been associated with the environment at all. We were not there in our thinking about loving this place. But she waited. Her time to inspire is now. Hopi Miwok poet Wendy Rose braids a wonderful narrative of the wounding losses suffered, not by natives, but by immigrants and their descendants. One that invites actually a bit of mercy for some prickly symptoms that testify to a deep and displaced hunger to belong to this land, to this America. With imagery reminiscent of the Middle Passage in Toni Morrison's work, Beloved, Wendy Rose graciously muses on these refugees' dilemma. These refugees are your ancestors. Refugees leaving their European lands, the blind hope of those who became foundlings on the shores of Turtle's Back. Her poem is titled Imagine It Like This, and it makes an appeal to empathically envision the pain of dislocation, this pain of amputation that I spoke of, that Merleau-Ponty expounds upon. And I'll read the poem. In the middle of the sea, there is a place of ghosts and transformation. When the people who lived to the east of magic began to itch and hurt, feeling fear and icicles running the length of their faces, they shed freezing tears and were drawn to the place of transformation with the frenzy of moths drawn to fire. They believed in their own powerlessness so deeply, lived in the ruins their leaders had made, dipped their newborn babes in polluted and dangerous water because it was thought they were born already in sin. Seeking redemption in the water they had polluted, they let the northern fog and the ocean take them, and only then, with layers of woven cloth and leather about their bodies, they faced the cold wind and sleet, set sail, said a prayer. They did not come all at once, but little by little, over 500 years. They reached as far west as they could to touch that magic place in the center of the sea and mount the great curve beyond which they would never return. Right in the middle of the ocean, they began to shed ancestry and heritage, dropping from their shoulders as termites drop their wings. Now they were transformed, born again, born free, truly who they were meant to be. And this time, they would try to get it right. These newcomers' reach, call it their overreach, to as far as they could, eventually showed itself in their insatiable appetite for land, for an ever-receding horizon of want. Peace could never be had on these terms, not with the first peoples of this land. The immigrants' fevered yet futile hope for relief rises in the last lines of Rose's poem and curiously resonates in the final scene of The Great Gatsby. Fitzgerald's familiar closing lines kind of echo back to us here. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eludes us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch our arms farther, and then one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Wendy Rose named settlers' yearning a longing to recuperate that magic place in the center of the sea where they shed their own ancestral bonds with home places and landscapes. They arrived on these shores bereft, already in a condition of deficit, and longing to be indigenous, longing, perhaps even desperate, to become part of a homeland in ways and in places and with contours that nostalgia imagines, but that can only be rooted in indigeneity. Mayflower or Ellis Island or Balseros from Cuba, American national citizenship cannot satisfy the deep hunger to belong to the earth at the level of autochthony. I love that word. It says self and ktonos, soil, self and soil, bound together. Wendy Rose's poem reveals clinical nostalgia as cultural pathology. The pathology often lurks just below the surface of a manic patriotic zeal. It makes the material and figurative erasure of Indian presence a political necessity in order to achieve a broad, homogeneous American identity. Yet ironically, Rose's lyrical version reminds us that this greedy desire corrodes settler souls as well as native souls. It has the capacity to infect all future generations. The sense of loss pervades Wendy Rose's diagnosis, an unrequited grief for a European homeland left behind forever, a tortured loss turned into rapid colonial desire. It began with loss and pain and nostalgia in emigres' hearts. So is there a condolence for this wound of loss? Belonging to this land requires a devotion beyond patriotism, one that regards homeland both as received gift and as a living relative, not merely owned property, nation state, landscape, aesthetic, or resource. Indigenous home entails a process of mutual recognition and reciprocity between all life forms in this place. It includes a rich dialogic interaction between people and place. This is the constitutive nature of true belonging to a home place. Land obtains the kinship of belonging by way of our affection for it. Learning to be this way with place is the moral challenge, tradition, and the mark of indigeneity, an indigeneity open to all who are willing to love this way. Historian Shelby Foote has stated, "A fact is not a truth until you love it." I would say a paraphrase here is that belonging to the land is no truth without a deep love for her body, rocks, rills, loam, and for all her inhabitant creatures and elemental forces. A true healing of isolation and alienation from our grandmother Earth must affect the human spirit that deeply. Please, show us that depth. Take us to that place. St. Kateri. Thank you. Yeah, any questions or? I have to say I was, I'm stating some things here that may not sit with all ears very comfortably, not refuting the Jesuit relations, but treating them as this kind of this literary captivity, that she's been ensconced in a one-sided story of who she is. We don't have her voice. Right? We don't have a sense of who she was. And who she was an Iroquoian woman, right? A very young woman. But what did that mean to be an Iroquoian woman? And that's why I kind of wanted to put this kind of what I call a paratactical approach, kind of putting stories side by side, not having one overwhelm the other, but letting them interact with one another, because they both can be true, right? They both can enrich one another if we just let them be what they are, right? And feed one another in a way that would have been hopeful if, the coming to these shores could have been like those beautiful Gothic windows, right? Instead of this, right? It would have been possible. But, I think Kateri shows us that it still can be true, but we have to love this place that way, right? Yes.
I find that incredibly inspiring, especially having worked with the Mohawk community right near the shrine.
Oh, yes.
With Tom Porter.
Yes, I know
Yeah.
Tom, right.
And I know that when I have taken students there, they were actually quite critical of Kateri because they felt, and I've read this,
Yes.
that traditional Mohawk communities felt that it was just a continuation of the process of colonization.
Yes.
And so how I see you trying to redefine that.
Yes.
So that it's not victimizing once
Yes.
again the
Exactly.
indigenous. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, and well, they even could critique her in Iroquois in general. They call her a leaky pot. There's a word, and I don't know the Mohawk word. They call her a leaky pot because they actually feel, politically speaking, that she leaked some secrets out to the, you know, so actually that she was kind of an informer, an informant. And you know, whether or not that's true, you get all levels of critique. I think that I understand the feelings behind that critique, and I have felt them myself. I mean, in the spirit of full disclosure, you know, my mother was went to I don't even know how to say it. It's so emotional. She's a survivor of the boarding schools, and she went to what was called the mush hole because the gruel was so horrible there, but it was the Mohawk school at Six Nations, and my mother passed away at 92, and she was an absolutely devout Christian all of her life. And yet she would do things, she would make certain herbs and medicines and do certain procedures, and I would ask her what she was doing. She said, well, that's just the way we do things. She knew not to give a name to it because to give a name to it was to make it visible. So she had her own methodology of kind of keeping things going by keeping them quiet, right? But all that to say that she went to the school during a time that, of course, children were beaten severely for speaking their language. They used to nick the ends of their tongue for speaking. She was in that group. Today, as we speak, they're still exhuming little bodies from outside of that school. And when I found that out, I only found that out about 3 years ago, of these exhumations. And they used to say, oh, well, that child just ran away. Right? And you hear of this, right? But this is my reservation and my mother's school. And I thought of the thin thread of possibility that I'm even here. And I understood that I had to kind of come to grips that part of her devotion was to survive. So meeting out and making peace in myself, she had much more grace. I speak of grace. She had much more grace than I'll ever have. She had a way of understanding her own history, the perpetrators that harmed her. She put it into a place in her heart and mind that she was able to live a beautiful life. I don't have that kind of grace. And my personal journey, spiritual journey, has been to try to work this out. I still don't get it. And there are parts of me that are very, I have to admit, unforgiving. I just have to say it. But I'm trying. I'm trying to get there. I'm trying to understand this way of Iroquoian grace, her way of grace, and put it together into something that I can transcend. The unhealthy, cannibalistic feelings I have sometimes. Those are the feelings of the cannibal. You're eating yourself. You don't move on. You don't resolve your grief and mourning. So part of my work with Kateri has been really to try to understand all of these things. And so, getting back to your question, I profoundly understand. And I started out my work with Kateri. I was right on the cutting edge of everything critical. And that just didn't bring out the good mind for me. Didn't work. I was right back there with Daradaho, you know, with the snakes in my hair, you know, and I couldn't live that way. So I said, I've got to do something else. That's not for me, that has not been a satisfying conclusion of who she has been and will continue to be. What I do think is important is this idea of exceptionalism. I think that the idea of extracting her from her community and celebrating her in a way that takes her not only away from her people and makes her exceptional. She's the lily of the Mohawks, unlike the rest of those that, you know, the heathen. There's something that troubles me deeply about that, because of all things, she was a person of the community. And what does that do also to her connection to her land? That doesn't help us at all in where we need to be, collectively, all of us, right? In redefining and re-experiencing what it means to be a human animal, along with all of these amazing other four-leggeds and two-leggeds. And it just doesn't help us. So I understand those feelings, but I found them to be not healthy for me. And that has kind of propelled me to do something different.
Right.
And I feel that she really was saying so much more. And saying it by way of bringing these amazing stories of creation, of condolence, of all of these stories that are extant today after all of the abuse of culture. These stories still exist. And why not lay them side by side and let them be together?
Right. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes, thanks for the question, because it kind of forced me to be a little more honest. Yes.
Thank you so much. You put together a whole unique way of seeing Kateri and not to deny her Iroquoian nature.
Right.
One of the things you said, which really affected me in the context of my study, say, of Navajo, Hopi, and Lakota, people who continue to live on their original homeland, because they were west of the Mississippi, as distinct from the Indian people, Cherokee, somebody that were in large part removed to the state of Oklahoma. But that sense that you mentioned of loss, and of course the whole issue of condolence is so unique to the Iroquoian tradition, but that what affected me was that sense of loss. If you lost an arm, and that pain is always there.
Yes.
Vicariously or whatever, it's a ghost pain.
Phantom
but
pain,
it's
right.
Phantom pain. And it made me think of the Indian people who have lost their land in a way that you could actually feel that kind of pain.
Yes.
And even for, say, the Lakota people who have lost so much of their land, and particularly the sacred spaces and places and
Right.
In the area, but that sense of loss is very, very profound in Indian thought and culture when it comes to the land especially. And most of us don't have that kind of a connection.
And I would suggest Wendy Rose's poem has something to do with that.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was going to say that Barbara was touching on something that was hitting me too, and I was struck by the graciousness of this loss being so much of the fabric of who you are, and in that pain, being able to understand the perhaps unrecognized pain of the immigrant.
Yes.
And how that whole idea is so needed right now as we deal with refugees and
Absolutely.
a country of immigrants that actually doesn't even know
That's
that
right.
it's mourning the loss
That's
of
right.
this land. And I was thinking personally of my family leaving their farm and coming here, and what effect that might have on my parents, and what do we do with the lands that are still there.
Absolutely.
So I was struck both by the graciousness that was rising out of the loss,
Yes.
and how much the culture can learn by claiming coming to this place
Yes.
as losing something.
That's
And
right.
what effect that might have politically, culturally, socially.
That's
everything
right.
else. It was really a wonderful insight. Thank you.
Yes, the whole idea of nostalgia and was born in Switzerland, and these mercenaries, these Swiss mercenaries, were dying of broken hearts when they were separated from their land. That idea, and they would identify it with the milk, the cows, all of these markers of that connection. But it is in all of us. We are all children of this earth, but of specific places. And to be able to claim to be American somehow has come to mean that you have to drop that. You have to drop the hyphen, right? You have to drop the hyphen. And in doing so, if I drop the hyphen, I'm really lost. If you drop the hyphen, you're lost too, but you don't know it. And because that isn't addressed, because the reward is always supposed to be on that horizon, on that Great Gatsby horizon. That's going to take care of the pain. Just whatever is over that horizon, the hope, right? That exceptionalism, we'll make it. That's a beautiful thing. That kind of spirit is beautiful. We always celebrate that. But what ache is that responding to as well? That we can't just find the peace. And until we all become indigenous in this way. So it's not just about being environmental. It's not just about, separating our trash. All of that is important, not unimportant at all. But something has to happen at the visceral level. Something has to be that profound, that integrated into the very sinews of our being. And that can happen. Grafting can happen, right?
That's what I was going to ask. With people on the move, part of this century right now is characterized by people on the move, from rural to urban,
Yes.
from country to country. And so where do we belong? And so there's on some level, globally, there's a sense of uprootedness.
Yes.
And so how is it possible to plant those roots and belong to a new place while still, carrying something of the old with you? I just wonder about
That's
that.
the work of it, for sure. Do I have any quick answers? Absolutely not. But that is the work of it. And that's not a work that I think as human beings and as God's children that we can walk away from. This amazing, the more explorations into outer space, the more unique we actually do find. The unique experience, the uniqueness, the exceptionalism is of our Creator. That this little blue ball might be the only place in the universe that this exists, and to find a way to celebrate that, to love it, to make sure that future generations have it in as best a state as possible. But how to do that? I think it takes time, and I think anything that takes us away from quiet contemplation in which we can plan meaningful action. That busyness is not good for us. It's just not, in my view, it's just not good for us because it takes us away from the possibility of what our souls and bodies need. The real medicine is to know that we are related to this place, that I am of this earth.
What struck me when you talked about bringing Christ into the longhouse.
Yes.
I thought that was almost like an aha moment, because we have always thought in terms of that we were bringing something to them.
Yeah.
Instead of.
And that's true. That's not untrue.
I know, but it for you, almost in a sense, it cuts into almost like diminishing this dualism.
Yes.
I think we, as a people, I think, that we are coming to a new level of consciousness, that things are more interrelated
Yes.
than they are separated.
Yes.
And we, for so many years, have had this dual philosophy, body and spirit.
Yes.
Even the language.
That's right. The Cartesian
right.
model, right?
I was very upset with when the new translation of the liturgy is with instead of moving towards this
Yeah.
unity, we're back to trying to separate
Yeah.
things, and I don't think that's where it is. I don't think that's where people are evolving to.
Mm.
And it just resonated with me when you said that, because Christ, God is bigger than any one culture, any one religion, or any words that we can use to talk about.
Yeah.
It is a God of surprises.
Yes.
And so, just the idea that God would come in, that Jesus would be into the longhouse, and all that that meant is really, so thank you.
You know that you remind me of a story of Charlotte Black Elk. She's, I think, the great-great-granddaughter of Black Elk Speaks of Nyhart's work. And in one talk that she gave once, she said, you know, when the missionaries came to the Lakota people and they told us about this Christ, and she said, and we said, now there's a Lakota man. You know, this beautiful understanding of how humans can be, how humans could be, right? And that's why he came here, right? There's a Lakota man. In an ideal.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.